Hey pirate fans around the world, this is Pirate Madagascar. Cemeteries, maps and an elusive hoard, graves on a tropical shore, cryptic charts, and the most stubborn treasure tale in the Indian Ocean. What do the stones and maps of Madagascar really reveal? Pirate cemeteries on Madagascar are real. Old charts do point toward hidden caches, and this story places both on the table. The plan is simple. Test the evidence. Follow the clues anyone can understand, and show why a hoard keeps slipping through careful fingers. Viewers can expect a close look at a weathered headstone that carries a maritime symbol many misread, a map with bearings that bend in ways a coastline no longer matches, and a calm step-by-step walk through a controversy that once made headlines and then quietly unraveled in a museum. Evidence comes first. Myths get a friendly cross-examination, and voices from local communities and historical archives will sit side by side, so the picture is fair and complete. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy and want to fall asleep with pirate stories whenever you want. Why Madagascar? The short answer arrives with the way the sea itself behaves east of Africa. The Indian Ocean squeezes between mainland and island to create the Mozambique Channel, a fast highway of current that ferried merchantmen, privateers and pirates through the 17th and 18th centuries, ships coming from the Cape of Good Hope toward the Red Sea and India, counted on prevailing winds and a pattern of eddies that could be read like a slow-moving clock. Madagascar, long and high, broke the ocean into lee shores and calm anchorages, ideal for careening a hull, taking fresh water, and waiting for the right prey to hove into view. Its eastern inlets offered shelter from sudden squalls. Its northern capes looked down on the channel like sentries, safe coves, steady trade lanes, and currents that guided the unlucky into ambush. Those three reasons drew sea rovers here, and they kept them here long enough to leave trace, rumor, and in a few places they're dead. As for the hoard itself, the phrase is used plainly. Gold and silver coins of many mints, bullion melted down from captured cargo, gemstones traded across the Indian Ocean, and more unexpectedly, valuable goods such as ivory, fine textiles, and even papers, charters, bills of lading, promissory notes worth money to the right buyer. In other words, not only shiny discs, but portable wealth in many forms. On a low rise under coastal trees, a small cemetery faces the water. The sea breathes in and out below the roots, and the stones tilt like ship masts caught in slow motion. This is where visitors often begin, because a graveyard feels like proof you can touch. There are flat slabs of coral limestone, some worked smooth, some left rough. There are headstones with chiseled borders and occasional iconography. A few carry a skull and crossed bones, but the symbol seen in place is not a cartoon of pirate flags. It belongs to a much older language of mortality, a memento mori as common on European gravestones as in seafaring lore. Here, those motifs mingle with crosses, anchors, and simple initials. The layout shows small groups of graves with gaps between, a clue that suggests family clusters or shipmates buried near one another. Inscriptions weather in the salt air. Many are barely legible, and some were always spare to begin with. A name, a date, a place of origin. When a story claims a headstone confesses where treasure lies, caution is healthy. Cemeteries can tell who gathered, when epidemics struck, and how maritime symbols carried across cultures. They rarely tell the location of a chest. What they do offer is network and presence, an English surname beside a French given name, a date that matches an outbreak noted in a ship's log, a style of carving known from a dockyard 2 oceans away. Those are real clues, quiet, grounded, and honest about their limits. And among these stones, 2 or 3 always pull attention. One bears an anchor flanked by small rosettes, and a line of letters that look like a code until the mind relaxes and recognizes a thinned-out phrase in broken French. Another shows the infamous skull and crossbones, cut not with swagger but with care, a reminder of death that could fit any early modern cemetery from Dublin to Barbados. A third is almost blank, except for a date and a tiny compass rose-like star, It triggers endless theories. Heads up on this. The fewer marks a stone has, the more meaning imagination tries to pour into it. Maps do a similar trick. They look certain when laid flat on a table. Then they start to move. The Indian Ocean was charted by many hands. Pilots who kept Rutter's narrative, sailing directions that read like intimate diaries of the coast. Cartographers working for companies such as the Dutch VOC, French hydrographic offices that standardized charts out of Paris and ports like Brest. One representative chart of Madagascar shows the big shape right, the skeleton of the island that satellites later confirmed. Around the edges, the details thin and thicken. A reef is drawn like a bristled brush. A sandbar curves where a river mouth now runs straight. A headland bears a name borrowed from another tongue and misspelled kindly. Bearings are written in neat numbers, and tide notes sit in the margins. The mind wants to say, here is the path. The sea answers, that was the path once. Coasts shift, estuaries wander, mangroves advance, storms push sand like a slow bulldozer. A map that fits a captain's eye in 1700 will refuse to sit still 3 centuries late. Positional error creeps in from every side. Instruments, copying by hand, the habit of trusting familiar rumors over fresh measurements, and the simple drift of place names when sailors adopt a local word, but pronounce it for their own mouth. Quick fact: change one letter in a place name, and a modern researcher can spend a year looking in the wrong bay. The story of Captain William Kidd circles Madagascar like a gull that refuses to leave a wake. Kidd's voyages, contracted under letters of marque and later condemned as piracy, intersected with the Western Indian Ocean at the turn of the 18th century. He operated where trade fattened and protection thinned. Madagascar enters his tale because anchorages among its coves allowed ships like the Adventure Galley to careen, refit and resupply. After his arrest and later execution in London in 1701, rumors multiplied. Coins bearing distant mints, a bar of something bright, a chart that hinted at a cache near a familiar inlet. Each new claim revived the idea that Kidd's fortune still whispered from island sands. In calmer light, the documentable links are more modest. His routes put him near Madagascar. His need for refuge made use of its inlets, and interactions with local leaders would have made that stay possible. Artifacts claimed in his name have often come wrapped in excitement and unwrapped into ordinary metal, misplaced context or untestable stories. Experts tend to accept the geography and the logistics. Yes, Kidd could have put in there. Yes, careening made sense. Yes, a temporary store of goods could have existed. They reject detail that rests only on wishful reading. A map copied in the 19th century that claims to be a Kidd original. A piece of metal pulled from a beach without a clear chain of custody. The Kidd case informs the elusive Hoard narrative by teaching a double lesson. Everything about Madagascar and pirate logistics makes a temporary stash plausible, and almost everything that turns up with a fanfare dissolves under basic checks. Another figure leaves a cipher-shaped wake. Olivier Levasseur, remembered by the nickname La Bouse, the buzzard. His legend lives on a scrap of paper, said to contain a cryptogram tossed from the scaffold at a French colonial execution. The island of Réunion holds the center of that tale. Yet the roots that grounded it crisscross the Western Indian Ocean, touching Madagascar, the Seychelles and the Mascarene Basin. The cipher itself has drawn patient minds for decades. Grids, acrostics, coordinate games and simple substitution ciphers, each proposed as a key. Pieces of the story have weight, real careers, real captures, real hanging. Other pieces were layered later, like posters glued over posters, until the wall looks thick. The overlap with Madagascar is not a firm arrow pointing to a chest under a tamarind. It is a reminder that ships, crews, and loot did not belong to single islands. They belong to a mobile economy. Why do ciphers and coded maps persist in Indian Ocean treasure lore? They satisfy a need for a final solvable secret in a world where most secrets were practical. Who to bribe, where to anchor without being seen, how to trade captured goods without attracting the wrong kind of attention. A cipher promises that patience equals gold. The sea knows patience often equals a good night's sleep and safe passage. Consider the hands behind the maps. Many of the best surviving charts were drafted in bureaucratic rooms, a long sail from the waters they described. A state hydrographer, who never rode out a cyclone inland from a Madagascar inlet, could still fix a coastline by compiling reports. Company cartographers stitched observations made by pilots who sailed not for science, but for wages. Copying introduced errors. Copying also hardened rumors into features. A cape noted once as possibly dangerous might become a black dot of certainty on the next edition. Danger symbols served a dual role, warning and insurance. If a chart marked a reef that never existed, and a ship avoided it, no one complained. If a chart omitted a reef and a ship struck, careers could end. In that cautious culture, hearsay often survived longer than accuracy. Over time, those copy errors morphed into treasure clues because any mark that looks odd attracts interpretation. A misplaced cross that signified a church can become, in an imaginative retelling, a secret cache marker. A dotted line showing a safe channel becomes, under the wrong lamp, a path to a cave. All of this sits on shore among people who lived, married, traded, and made choices that shaped pirate survival. Malagasy communities did not exist as a backdrop. They were active partners in some periods and regions. Alliances were made for mutual benefit. Pirates needed safe water, fruit, meat, local knowledge, and artisans who could mend and build. Chiefs and confederations needed goods, protection, and sometimes a way to balance rival forces. Marriages created kin ties. Children with European and Malagasy parentage were not rare. Languages braided together in harbors and villages. Place names carry traces of these meet points. Cemeteries reflect them too. A surname common in Bristol sits beside a Malagasy given name. A date aligns with a season when a local confederation grew under a leader whose story is still told. Why would any real hoard require local complicity? Because hiding value is not a one-day job. A cache must be buried, guarded, checked, and eventually moved or spent. That chain of actions depends on people who know the land. Without community help, a grand treasure chest becomes a heavy problem no foreign crew can lift for long. A name that often appears in half smiles and raised eyebrows is Libertalia, a supposed pirate republic that many wish were true. Its printed birth comes from early 18th century pages that mix authentic biographies with imaginative scenes. The utopian haven it describes, where pirates set aside flags and tyrants and rule themselves with wise equality, reads more like a political pamphlet than a report from a harbor. Archives fall quiet where the story shouts, and archaeology has not lifted it out of legend. Why does Libertalia matter if it likely never existed? Because the idea bends modern expectations. When a viewer hears Madagascar, the mind may conjure a libertarian experiment in the tropics and then expect a dramatic singular hoard to match. The real island offered something different and in its way more interesting. Practical alliances, mixed communities, and money that moved through the same markets as spices, silk, and salt beef. So what exactly is meant by the hoard? Imagine the spoils of the Indian Ocean trade world passing through a ship's hold. Spanish silver reales from the Americas, paid out in Manila and reappearing in Asian ports. Indian rupees from Mughal mints, Dutch and French coinage, Portuguese modas, and local issues. Silver and gold did not stay in neat piles. Bullion could be melted, recast, and turned into ingots or jewelry. Gems crossed the ocean in small containers. Diamonds, rubies, sapphires, sometimes pearls, each worth far beyond their weight when carried to a buyer with coin in hand. Add to this the goods that modern treasure tales skip, but captains prized. Bales of cloth, particularly Indian textiles, that commanded strong prices, ivory tusks, spices, fine metalwork, and even paper. A set of bills of lading or a letter promising payment could be as valuable as a handful of coins if presented in the right city to the right office. How would pirates cash or move value? Heavy, Noisy chests belong more to legend than to good sense. Value tends to break down into smaller units, jars buried in dry sand within a known number of paces from a fixed tree, cloth sealed against damp, metals hidden near fresh water so the crew could return without carrying barrels. Concealment patterns cluster near anchorages and reliable streams. Logistics matter. A chest of coins is manageable. 10 chests are a liability, especially when cyclones visit and crews need to run light. Weight forces choice. The smartest caches are portable and layered. Part hidden ashore, part held on a consort ship, part traded fast to convert loot into supplies and local goodwill. When people picture treasure, they picture gold. In practice, they should also picture cloth and promise. Clue hunting today means layering old charts over new coasts. And it begins with admitting the shoreline has shifted. Coastline change, driven by sedimentation, sea level variation, and mangrove growth, means a beach drawn long ago might now be a muddy inlet. Modern tools help, but they cannot resuscitate a headland that storms shave to a stump. GPS gives precise positions, satellites add contour, tidal ranges can be predicted with accuracy. The art is in translation. Triangulation from headlands and reefs is simple geometry. A navigator notes from point A bearing northeast by east 6 miles to a sandbar, then steer east to pass a reef shown by breaking water river mouth ahead. If point A has slumped and the river mouth migrated, the original triangle contracts or expands. Identifying mismatched toponyms is another careful step. A place name pronounced in a European style might be a softened version of a Malagasy word, and a researcher must listen for the original shape. A focused mini demo. An old bearing says from Cape Saint something, steer NNE until you see the twin palms on the headland. Then turn east half a point for 2 leagues. Modern translation needs a cape that fits, an allowance for twin palms that no longer stand, and an understanding that east half a point is a fraction of a compass division not used today. Convert leagues to nautical miles, adjust for likely compass error and draw an arc. The resulting search box may sit partly on land that used to be sand and partly in shallow water that used to be land. That is where a careful dig or dive starts, not where a chest must be. Now to the expeditions and controversies, the part that invites headlines and then demands patience. Over the years, teams have announced discoveries around Madagascar's coves and islands. A bar lifted from the sea gleams like silver. It travels to a museum. It receives tests. The story shifts. Officials weigh in. Conservators measure alloys. Statements are amended. This cycle teaches something essential. Verification is not a buzzkill. It is the difference between a souvenir and a find. Conservation standards exist because the moment an object leaves its context, data is lost. A chest moved from a layer of sediment. Without recording that layer's chemistry loses its date. Salvage aims for speed and sale. Science aims for knowledge and preservation. It is not that one is always wrong and the other always right. It is that their goals in the moment rarely align. Lessons learned from these episodes now shape how researchers read the cemetery and the maps. A skull and crossbones on a grave is not green light for a spade. A dot on a chart is not an arrow. If an object appears, it must be documented with its precise location, photographed in place, and then tested by a lab that has no stake in a dramatic outcome. Calm process protects real story. A calm process also diffuses myths that linger because they are fun to repeat. 4 deserve a friendly debunk. First, the famous X marks the spot. On practical maps, X marks many things. 10 degrees, a temporary camp, a wish. Treasure charts with bold X's tend to be late fakes or harmless doodles. The alternative is a pattern of bearings and distances that point to a place without shouting. Second, the evergreen skull and bones. On graves, the motif means mortality, not membership in a pirate club. It appears in churchyards across Europe and the Americas and signals the blunt truth that life ends. Third, the omniscient master map. The idea that one chart contains every cache laid by a fleet of captains. Real captains did not risk everything on a single page someone else could steal. They used memory, trusted men and simple directions for small stashes. Fourth, the sign that a coconut tree leaning 17 degrees means dig here. Trees are unreliable witnesses. Storms rearrange them. The better explanation for oddly leaning trees is wind, not code. Heads up on this. Busting a myth does not make a story smaller. It makes the remaining truth easier to see. Comparative cemeteries help measure what is typical and what is special. In one Atlantic harbor long used by privateers, graves carry anchors and suns without pirate headlines. In a Caribbean outpost, markers mix Spanish and English names with no hint of hidden gold beneath them. Those comparisons show that maritime symbols on headstones are normal where sailors lived and died. What is unique in Madagascar's sites is the mix of elements: European carving techniques adapted to local stone, inscriptions that slip between languages, and placement that reflects both view of the sea and use of the land by nearby villages. The result is not a novelty museum, but a record of an international shoreline. Decoding symbols deserves its own gentle field guide, kept short enough to remember. An anchor tends to signal hope or safe harbor. In Christian art, on seafarers' graves it can also simply mean this person worked at sea. A compass rose can measure the idea of a life steered correctly. It can also be an artisan's flourish. Crossed bones under a skull ask the living to remember mortality. Ropes, knots, and shells can hint at trades. What symbols do not mean a skull by itself is not a guarantee of a pirate's burial, and an anchor over a line is not code for bearing and distance. When a mark looks unfamiliar, ambiguity is not failure. It is honesty. Responsible handling of ambiguity keeps each clue in proportion. A stone with 3 circles and a line may be a mason's signature, not a secret direction to a creek bed. To fix all of this in time, a quick chronological spine helps. Madagascar's pirate century is not neat, but its rhythm can be felt. European and Arab traders had used these seas for centuries. European privateers and pirates became frequent in the late 17th century, as wars created both opportunity and crackdowns. The peak arrives when trade is fat, war is constant, and naval patrols thin out in distant waters. Suppression follows as empires decide the cost of tolerating sea rovers is too high and send ships with orders and new laws. After lives linger in mixed communities, in sons and daughters who belong to both worlds, and in stories told to explain stones on a hill. On that spine, the cemetery appears after enough crews have passed through to leave their dead. The mapping episodes concentrate when companies invest heavily in accurate charts. The likeliest moments for creating a cache align with windows of danger, when a crew expects a patrol or storm, and needs to store weight until a safer time. What if someone today wanted to go looking purely as a thought exercise? Law, ethics, and risk set the stage before any excitement. Many coastal areas are protected heritage sites. Digging without permission damages history and can break local and national law. Communities live with these places. Their stake is not theoretical. Environmental hazards are real. Soft sand over rock, sudden squalls, currents that look gentle and pull hard, and the ever-present risk of damaging a site beyond repair. Responsible research works in a simple order: permit, survey, documentation, then only if justified. Small, careful interventions overseen by people trained to conserve what they touch. A thought experiment should end with respect for people and place, not a spade in the sand. The environment itself acts like a quiet co-author of every treasure story. Storm tracks lay across Madagascar's coasts. Cyclone history shows repeated episodes of surge and sand migration. Anchors, chests, and ceramics behave differently under such forces. Heavy anchors can dig in and survive with minimal movement. Wooden chests rot, releasing coins that scatter in patterns a current understands. Ceramic jars can break, leaving fields of shards that map a ship's last hours. A cache near a river mouth may migrate seaward in slow tumbles. A cache near a barrier reef might be buried by coral sand one season and exposed the next. The sea keeps secrets is a phrase spoken with a smile. The more accurate version is gentler. The sea changes slowly, and change erases lines that seemed obvious. Even when the sea calms, human factors keep a hoard hidden. Deception as a strategy makes sense in a world without safe banks. Crews could leave false markers to mislead pursuers, or even future enemies among their own kind. Decoy caches, buy time. Dead reckoning, the practice of estimating position based on heading and speed, introduces gaps that grow over time, so a return party might miss by a small but fatal margin. Witnesses die, memories fragment, names for places drift, and printed sources amplify confident mistakes. Cemetery narratives can be retrofitted to treasure tales because they are sturdy. A stone never moves much. A story can be tied to it at leisure. A visitor sees a skull on a slab and creates a line to a chest that never existed. The brain is a mapmaker that loves an easy arrow. The economic context is the quiet backbone. Follow the money, and the hoard's shape changes. Indian Ocean trade networks moved coin because coin made trade faster. But coin was never the only store of value. Bullion could be melted. Cloth could be sold for more in one port than another. Spices acted like currency. Mint shortages and reminting practices meant coins could be melted and reissued, making it tricky to match a piece of silver found today to a specific ship taken then. Non-coin valuables could outstrip coins in worth. When the buyer wanted them, a bale of fine cloth might change a chief's political fortunes more than a sack of coins. All this supports a case for dispersed hoards, value kept in several places and several forms rather than a single jackpot waiting under a single tree. It is less romantic to imagine, but it matches how people manage risk when the sea is their bank. To make space for curiosity, a quick montage of treasure trails compresses high-interest leads into clear verdicts. First, a map note claims a split rock by the bay, marks a turn inland. The rock exists. The split is natural, verdict promising as a landmark, not as a code. Second, a grave with a compass rose carved off-center seems to point at a distant hill. Measurements show the carving's orientation aligns with the stonecutter's habit, not a bearing. Verdict weak. Third, a log fragment mentions bartered silver for beef. Near a specific river, archaeology finds butchered bone waste. Near a centuries-old village site, verdict plausible context, not a cache. Fourth, a rumor places a chest in a cave halfway between two capes, where the waves sigh. The coastline has 3 such caves, all swept by surge, verdict busted for safety reasons alone. Fifth, an oral history says grandfather saw coins by the roots after a storm. Storms do reveal, roots do clutch, verdict promising if tied to a documented erosion event and followed gently, with permission and care. Quick fact, the best leads respect both land and people. With those trails explored, attention can return to the ledger. What holds up after a long walk? Pirate cemeteries exist and show mixed communities with maritime symbols. Strong, old charts show anchorages and hazards that make strategic sense. Strong, specific treasure map clues dissolve under analysis. Speculative, expeditions that announced spectacular finds often fell short under independent tests. Debunked or unproven, a hoard in the sense of value stored in several forms and places remains plausible. Plausible, the existence of a single intact enormous chest, left untouched for centuries under an often visited tree, remains the least likely version of events. Weak, some questions remain open, and honestly so, whether certain inlets hosted temporary caches that were later moved, whether particular artifacts in local museums come from documented contexts that can still be examined, whether underwater sites near known careening places hold small, recoverable traces worth conserving. Back on the shore, the light has softened. The cemetery is the same. Leaning stones, quiet symbols. the ocean repeating its simple lesson. The maps have not stopped moving, but they have slowed, just enough to be useful when read without hurry. The Hoard in this calmer view is elusive because it is not one thing. It is lives intersecting on an island where currents meet, lives that turned coins into cloth, and back again, lives that married across languages, lives that wrote maps both on paper and in memory. Madagascar matters in pirate memory because it was real enough to work safe water, watchful hills, and people who made deals. Madagascar matters in pirate reality for the same reason. If a next chapter is promised, it will be a deep dive on a single chart maker whose careful errors shaped generations of searching, or a documented wreck whose story can be told without guessing. For now, the shore keeps its balanced stones that remember, maps that move, and a treasure tale that stays just out of reach, not to tease, but to remind that the past is richer when it is shared, not seized. The shoreline that seemed to close the story opens again as the tide settles, because the island refuses to be summarized in a single glance, and the evidence is generous when given time. The sea lanes that drew captains toward this coast can be pictured with a child's globe and a finger tracing arcs. Ships that rounded the Cape of Good Hope looked for steady winds. The southern Indian Ocean offered them, and the channel between Africa and Madagascar acted like a funnel, narrowing traffic into predictable paths. A vessel in need of repair preferred a lee shore, a place where wind and waves quieted behind land. Madagascar, long as a stretched sail, made many such calm spots. The land in return asked for nothing special: fresh water from a stream, fruit from nearby groves, wood for fires, and a place to roll a ship on her side and scrape the hull clean. That practical exchange, safe anchorage for careful behavior, built the pattern that would leave graves, stories, and the rumor of a hoard. A visitor walking inland from one quiet cove reaches a cemetery made of simple stones. There is no iron fence, just brush and the occasional whisper of insects. The slabs lie thick where the ground runs highest. Downslope, sand begins to win. Names are shallow, some letters are barely more than scratches. A caretaker from a nearby village, who keeps the path clear when the grass grows, offers this. People point at the skulls and say the word pirate. The bones do not argue, but the stones speak more languages than the skulls do. He smiles, and his words hold a small lesson. The symbols that visitors love to photograph carry many meanings, and the context matters more than any single mark. When an anchor appears above a name, it might say sailor or hope. When a simple cross is chiseled into coral stone, it might echo a European tradition, or it might be the best way a local mason knew to represent a life and a faith told secondhand. A compass-like star can be decoration, a flourish, or a symbol chosen because it felt right to the family that paid for the work. The cemetery gives honest answers about presence and memory and keeps quiet about hiding places. Close by, the discussion returns to maps, because maps try to turn stories into lines, and lines can be measured. A pilot's rudder from long ago reads almost like a bedtime story told by someone who remembers every shoreline by its smell and color. Keep the eastern cape to starboard until the sand takes a reddish tone. That is the river that turns shallow. In modern words, this means look for a change in sediment color. It marks a freshwater mouth. But rivers in sandy countries move. They shift their mouths after heavy seasons, and mangroves feed on that opportunity, expanding like a slow green tide. A chart drafted in a company office far away might copy that rudder, convert reddish sand into a symbol, and add a caution about a shallow bar. The next edition might copy the caution, but drop the note about the sand color. Later, a searcher might see a symbol for a shallow bar where none exists now and think it is a hint placed by a clever hand. The truth is simpler and kinder. People doing their best to save ships copied what they heard and what they saw, and time changed the coast underneath their efforts. Quick fact: if a chart shows a danger that no one has ever hit, it can still be a true chart, because the warning itself made sailors steer wide. A slow step-by-step demonstration of translation helps the mind settle. An old note says, "From the cape like a crouching ox, steer northeast by east for 3 miles to the outer bar. Keep the twin palms lined until the right-hand reef breaks white. Then turn to east for 2 miles to the cove with the stream." The shape of a cape that looks like an animal is friendly to remember and hard to match after centuries, because cliffs slump and trees change the outline. The bearing northeast by east belongs to a 32-point compass rose. On that rose, northeast by east sits 1 point east of northeast, a narrow slice. 3 miles could be sea miles of different lengths depending on the mapmaker's habits. The outer bar is a sandbar off the river mouth. The twin palms are tall today and gone tomorrow if a storm takes them. The reef breaking white is a cue that survives if swell patterns remain. The instruction to turn east for 2 miles to find the cove with the stream depends on the stream still meeting the sea in that cove. If the stream now arrives farther down the beach, cove fooled people who did not know it had moved. Triangulation corrects for some of this. A modern researcher draws one line from the cape at the right bearing and another from a fixed rock known to stand through time. Where they meet, a search box begins. A drone, a handheld GPS, and a tide table complete the toolkit. The work is not romantic in the old sense. It is patient and, in its way, more satisfying. With patience established, the narrative returns to Captain Kidd for a gentler profile than legend grants. His career, viewed without theatrics, belonged to a world where governments handed commissions and then regretted the political cost. Letters of marque made private war legal in a narrow lane. Step a foot outside, and the same act became piracy in the courtroom. Madagascar entered the story because it sat where money moved and law thinned. Kidd's need to keep his ship seaworthy brought him into the shelter of coves, with clean sand for careening and streams cold enough to keep crews healthy. His choices, made at sea under pressure, cast long shadows in pamphlets and at trials. After his death, the idea that a portion of his wealth lay hidden somewhere in or near Madagascar grew because it solved a riddle people liked. What happened to all that value? Serious minds note that much of it was spent, traded, lost, or seized, because money moves faster than stories. Even so, the island's combination of shelter and traffic made it a logical place to leave something for later. Logical does not mean the same as proven, and that distinction separates a calm tale from a breathless one. Labuza's cipher tale invites a different calm. The picture of a condemned man tossing a coded message into the crowd polished itself through retellings, each version shining the act until it sparkled more with each decade. Codes attract problem solvers. The systems proposed substitution alphabets, grid transpositions, pictograms, have a charm that can be explained to a child with paper and pencil. A historian of cryptography offers this gentle reminder: a code that works once in a novel must work for every line in the document if it is real. Many proposed keys solve a phrase or two beautifully and then need a new rule to explain the next sentence. That is a sign of wishful thinking. The Indian Ocean knew real codes of a more ordinary kind. Arrangements whispered between agents, signals worked out in advance between ships, and a promise that a certain flag meant a certain intention. Those codes rarely leave pretty papers in their wake. They leave quiet success. Cartographers with steady hands and cold lamps connected all these movements. A company cartographer compiling reports believed in layers. A pilot wrote a margin note. The cartographer added it, sometimes with a small qualifier, sometimes as a hard mark. If the office preferred certainty, the cartographer's boss wanted a product that kept ships safe and kept the company out of court. So the mark leaned toward caution. That is how a dot travels from a comment to a feature. When a later reader looks for treasure, that dot can be mistaken for a secret, especially if it sits near a cove, now known by a name that sailed in from Europe. A historian of maps notes that some of the most persistent errors traveled the farthest because no one wanted to be the person who erased a danger and was wrong. In most cases, the error did not sink a ship. It just made the passage slower. That inertia is how myths find a home on a chart that never intended to shelter them. Back on land, communities tell stories that combine maritime life and local politics. Pirate crews bought food, traded goods, and sometimes married into families, which turned a temporary anchorage into a place where children learned multiple languages and customs, rubbed against each other until they fit. A grandmother in a coastal village tells the same story every year on a festival day about a man with a beard like driftwood who brought a fabric so soft it made neighbors gasp. She laughs as she says it, because the fabric matters more than the man's name. This kind of story explains how a bale of cloth could be worth more in practice than a sack of coin in certain seasons. It also explains how a cache could be safe in a grove because a family agreed to watch it for a price. Any real hoard in such a world would live only as long as it served many people and did not attract punishment from a distant governor. The name Libertalia returns as an example of how printed pages change expectations. The Republic described in those pages, a place without kings, without slavery, without hierarchy, belongs to the wish list of someone who hoped the sea could wash away the limits of the land. The island that the book drew in letters and lines is not the island that lived with storms and taxes. The gap between wish and weather is instructive. When a viewer imagines a perfect pirate republic, the next step is to imagine a perfect treasure buried during a perfect vote. The island's actual mixture of alliance and bargain teaches a better lesson. Communities organize around practical needs and then tell ideal stories to honor the parts they like best. The map of the mind is elegant. The map of the shore is messy. Turning back to the Hoard, a clearer picture forms by listing real cargoes and the routes they took. Spanish silver crossed from the Americas to Asia. It paid for goods in Manila and came back as coin or product into Indian Ocean markets. Indian rupees moved locally and regionally. The marks on their faces do not change the fact that they bought food, cloth, and service where they landed. Dutch and French coins came with ships and left with traders. Bullion melted and reshaped answered to whoever had a steady fire and a mold. Gems packed small but traveled far. Their value depended on who could certify them in a city and who wanted them that year. An ivory tusk was hard to hide, but easy to mark. As for papers, a letter promising payment, accepted in a certain office, could act like money in miniature. When a captain seized a ship, he did not find a single kind of wealth. He found a mix, and that mix turned into other mixes as it moved across the water. That is why any hoard worth discussing would have been a portfolio, carefully chosen to match needs and the next destination. The work of overlaying old and new maps continues with the tide. Modern analysts classify shore segments by change rate: stable rock, moderately changing sand, highly dynamic river delta. They give higher trust to features that last, headlands, hills with bedrock, reefs fixed in limestone, than to features that breathe sandbars, mangroves. A practical tip from a coastal geographer: when an old chart uses a single tree as a reference point, look around for the line of wind that made the tree lean. The line remains even when the tree is gone. The lean tells the general wind direction, which can confirm the old compass bearing. Another tip: convert old distances not just by arithmetic, but by pace. If a pilot wrote 1 hour by oars between 2 points, the distance changes if there was a current, a headwind, or a loaded boat. The phrase can mean 3 different numbers. Interpreting it humbly is better than demanding it match a preferred figure. Mention of expeditions and controversies brings in a conservator's voice. Careful and measured. Objects pulled from the sea can tell a long story if they are allowed to stabilize before being cleaned. Salt crystals inside metal expand and crack the piece if rushed. Recording the layer they came from can fix them in a calendar. This kind of reminder puts romance in its proper seat. A bar raised on a sunny day looks like instant proof. A lab record written in a windowless room months later turns out to be the key to whether that bar belonged to a shipwreck from the right century or a modern spill. Officials who oversee heritage sites speak in the same tone. There is pride in the island's history and a wish to keep it for children. That is the stake, plain and deep. Softly, the myths return for a second. Shorter review, because repetition is how stories take hold. the skull and bones on a headstone, the X, the one map that solves everything, the tree that always points. Each myth falls apart under gentle pressure. Alternative explanations, memento mori, cautious chart making, distributed memory, wind lines, prove more durable. Myths are not scolded. They are invited to sit on a lower shelf, where they can entertain without being asked to carry weight they cannot hold. Comparative cemeteries add one more tool: scale. A harbor that served whalers for 50 years has graves with similar symbols, but no treasure rumors because the community understood those symbols as normal. A port that saw multiple nationalities bury their sailors carries carvings in different styles without anyone trying to read coded bearings out of them. Madagascar's coastal graves feel different, not because the stones themselves are more mysterious, but because the larger story of pirates and hoards hangs above them like a colorful banner. The stones look up and keep their secrets. A field guide to decoding symbols gains new entries through practice. A rope carved above a name can signal that the person worked lines on a ship. It can also be a border that a mason liked to cut. A shell can mean pilgrimage in some traditions and proximity to the sea in others. The double circle motif seen on one grave could be a mason's shorthand for eternity, or simply a way to fill space that looked empty. When doubt remains, the respectable answer is unknown, and that answer leaves room for a future family to share a story that puts meaning back without forcing it. Ambiguity is not the enemy. It keeps the door open to real memory. The timeline of Madagascar's pirate century can be stretched like a rope between posts and weighted with a few dates to keep it straight. Before the 17th century ended, European powers had already strained against each other on other coasts. Those strains sent privateers and pirates farther afield. By the first years of the 18th century, the Western Indian Ocean was busy with ships that carried flag and commission in complicated combinations. Suppression tightened as navies grew more capable and political costs rose. After the main wave passed, the shoreline did not become empty. It shifted to new kinds of traffic and new local arrangements. The pirate cemetery belongs to that phase too. Burials continue until the community wears a different shape, then stop when the community changes again. The map stories track the same way. Company interest peaks and fades with trade priorities. The best moments for burying or moving value align with crisis. War news, storms, famine, and those crises can often be identified in multiple sources now. A log, a letter, a report from a fort. When those sources line up with a headstone date, the odds of a small temporary cache rise from fantasy to plausible. A thought exercise about search ethics keeps the pace gentle. A law that protects a site exists because earlier generations saw damage done when curiosity outran care. A community that guards a cemetery expects visitors to behave as guests, not as owners. Environmental risk touches searchers and sites alike. Even picking up a potsherd can remove information if the surrounding soil is not recorded. A responsible project builds in community voices, local hiring, and transparency. When a team speaks with those who steward the land, respect becomes practical, not poetic. Storms and oceanography re-enter the story because the sea leaves fingerprints everywhere. Cyclones lift and drop sand in sheets. Currents pull small objects until they settle in predictable hollows. A diver trained to read those hollows can sometimes find a scatter of heavy items that fell together. Coins near a buckle, nails near a plank, shards of ceramic near a cooking tool. A cache hidden onshore has a different fate. Roots crack containers, animals dig, and flood water can move a jar far from where it was first placed. A gentle rule of thumb says that the heavier the object and the more sheltered its setting, the more likely it is to stay near its original spot. The lighter the object and the more open the setting, the larger its travel radius over time. Knowing this narrows the search areas without pretending certainty. Human strategies keep returning because they are where the story breathes. Deception worked because it did not have to fool everyone forever. It only had to buy a day, a week, a season. A false marker, one hill over, wastes a pursuer's time. A decoy cache, lighter than it looks, satisfies a quick search. Directions given only to a few mean that a death can break a chain that might have reached back to a grove. Printed sources pick up rumors like burrs. Once caught, those rumors travel farther than facts that weighed more in their own time. A calm mind plucks off the burrs and keeps walking. The economics of the sea. Keep the ledger clear. When the market valued cloth more than coin in a certain port, a captain who wanted food and goodwill bought cloth with coin and used cloth to pay for services. Later, when coin was needed to pay someone who accepted nothing else, cloth became coin again. That is why a hoard might be a cave with jars of silver in one year and a storeroom with bales of fabric in another. The value never stopped moving. A scholar of early modern money puts it this way: think of value like water in a canal system. It fills whichever basin traders happen to dig. It is never all in one pool for long. That image helps explain why so few single, untouched caches last for centuries. A longer montage of treasure trails fills the canvas with variety and verdicts that respect nuance. A weathered note found inside a second-hand book, bought at a port that once served privateers, mentions the stone with a hole where the goat drinks. A searcher finds a stone basin near a spring scarred by an iron ring long rusted away. Goats still come. This could be a meeting spot, a watering place for caravans, or a marker used by generations. Verdict promising as a social coordinate, not proof of a stash. A chart shows 3 small crosses near a cliff. A later hand labels them church. The region never held a church there, but it did hold 3 graves. Verdict mislabeling that later readers made into mystery. The better explanation is a symbol set carried over from a different map series. A sailor's diary uses a term for a reef that modern dictionaries translate poorly. Local elders still use a word that fits the shape perfectly. Verdict place name drift reversed by community memory, valuable for aligning old text with current geography. A traveler's tale from a century later says, people still bring up coins after storms. Interviewed elders agree storms expose old layers, but they add that the coins might come from a wreck that broke within sight of the shore and not from any buried chest. Verdict plausible, with a limited search window after each big storm, always with permission. A rumor blames a specific grave for hiding the key, but the family who tends it recounts a different story altogether. The symbol is for a son lost at sea. Verdict closed to speculation out of respect, a reminder that living memory outranks clever guesses. As the montage fades, the evidence ledger strengthens. Items move to different columns based on everything seen and heard. The ledger now reads like a museum label that does not shy away from uncertainty. Cemeteries. Firmly real, with clear maritime connections, places of layered identity where local and foreign hands shaped memory together. Maps, robust for safe navigation and honest in their limits, valuable for locating anchorages and for reconstructing sailing practices, weak when treated as treasure codes. Expeditions, mixed. The best ones are patient and documented. The loudest announcements often lose detail under testing. Hoards, dispersed in life, dispersed in aftermath. Small caches entirely possible. Single enormous chest under the same tree for 3 centuries, unlikely. Night settles as if to prove that subtlety can hold attention longer than spectacle. A gentle wind crosses mangroves and carries the smell of salt and leaves. The cemetery holds its place, and the graves do not change shape for cameras or flashlights. A child might ask why people buried far from home would lie with their faces to the sea. A simple answer is offered. It was what the living wanted, so they could remember the dead belonged to both land and water. That answer grows with the viewer. It explains why the stones matter even when they refuse to point toward gold. They are proof of belonging in a place where ships came and went. A cartography historian sits with a notebook and explains a favorite example that ties all threads. A 17th century chart marks a small inlet with an elegant flourish, then writes a single word that means quiet. Later charts remove the flourish and leave the inlet without a note. For 2 centuries, that inlet remains quiet, because the main road of trade passes elsewhere. In the 20th century, a new harbor is dug beyond it, and the inlet becomes a backwater for fishermen. The cemetery sits above it all. The word quiet on that old chart is not romantic, it is observational. Quiet places invite refuge. Refuge invites stories. Stories invite hoard rumors. The chain makes sense when each link is shown in good light. A gentle reminder closes in, whispered by the patterns the viewer has just learned to recognize. The most engaging clues in the first 10 minutes. The anchor on a stone, the moving coastline, the contradictions between a gleaming bar and a lab result have gained depth, not lost it. The stones say who gathered, the maps say how they moved. The hoard, redefined as value in motion, explains why the story persists without a single jackpot. To end it, the viewer who arrived for treasure finds treasure of another kind, a felt understanding of how people lived between sea and shore. A final walk puts everything back where it belongs. The narrator returns to the cove, but speaks only of what anyone can see and know. The ocean gives back coins, sometimes, because storms are generous in strange ways. Villages keep paths clear to the graves, because ancestors deserve respect regardless of their flags. Archival pages sleep until someone reads them kindly, and when they are read kindly, they give accurate maps of behavior even when the coastline has changed. The elusive hoard becomes a phrase with a precise meaning, the part of the past that remains out of reach, not because it is teased, but because it belongs to a web of choices, tides and hands that cannot be collected in one place. That precise meaning comforts rather than frustrates. It shows that the fascination with Madagascar's pirate century does not require a single chest to be opened. It requires attention to stones that remember and charts that guide. At the last, a seabird crosses from headland to headland, tracing the line that ships once followed. The cemetery, steady on its rise, continues to look over the horizon, as if counting sails. The maps on a table nearby, old and new, refuse to be enemies. They lie together, like relatives who have argued and decided to share the same meal. And the hoard, still elusive, takes its rightful seat at the center of the tale. Less a pile of metal and more a living pattern that explains why this island mattered then and why it still matters to anyone who cares about honest stories told without hurry. The closing thought returns the promise made at the start, quietly fulfilled. What the stones and maps of Madagascar really reveal is not a single spot to dig, but the shape of a world where risk, refuge, and relationship decided the fate of every coin, every chart, and every life that came ashore.